Madam Speaker, I want to start by acknowledging that it's not often that all MPs agree in this chamber, especially around this time of year. Politics can be particularly divisive and partisan. However, all members from all parties have come together to support my private member's bill, but really to support survivors of intimate partner violence. And I want to extend my gratitude. I hope that we can all think of this bill as an example of the great things that we can accomplish when we reach across the aisle and collaborate, when we work together to put aside political differences, focusing on the needs of our constituents. We can change their lives for the better. And in Canada, a woman is killed by an intimate partner every 6 days. Let that sink in. Every 6 days, we lose a woman to intimate partner violence. And it disproportionately impacts Indigenous women. 22% of the women killed are Indigenous women. I want to also acknowledge that yesterday was the 5th year anniversary of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. And after 5 years, only 2 calls to justice have been implemented. 2 out of 231. When the report was tabled, the Commission confirmed that the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis is a genocide. And yet the government has delayed and delayed. Former Commissioner Michelle Audette says that she has lost faith in the government's ability to tackle this issue. Madam Speaker, I want to remind my colleagues that as elected officials in Canada, we have a responsibility to stop the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The 2019 report highlights that intimate partner violence disproportionately impacts Indigenous women and girls. And in the same way that all parties have worked across party lines to support my bill on coercive control, I call on MPs in this House to put aside political differences and to tackle the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, implement the calls to justice, including fully funding a red dress alert. I want to thank the member from Winnipeg Centre for her leadership and advocacy on this. And we know that coercive control is one of the most common precursors to femicide, even when there have been no other instances of physical violence. I've spoken in the past about how coercive control has impacted my family, but I've also heard from hundreds of people across Canada who have written to me, met with me, spoken to me about how coercive control has impacted them, either directly or through loved ones. Each person who has shared their story told me how grateful they are that this piece of legislation exists, and that they hope that no one will ever have to go through what they experienced. And while each story is unique, the pain is very similar. The pervasiveness of coercive control is all-encompassing, and the trauma is deeply rooted. One story that sticks with me, it is from a constituent of mine, and she's asked me not to use her name in fear of retribution from her abuser. But she has given me permission to share her story. So for her anonymity, we'll call her Lisa. And Lisa spoke to me about how she experienced coercive control by her children's father. Her abuser had taken over every single aspect of her life. And like so many other stories, the abuse eventually became physical. When she finally was able to escape that relationship, her abuser began to control her through her children. The father of Lisa's children would withhold her children from her, threaten them. She had to do what he wanted just to see her own children. When the issue of child support was in front of the courts, the judges ignored the fact that Lisa had been sexually assaulted and abused by the father of her children, who were now being withheld from her. And she spoke about how the legal system favors men so heavily that even when Lisa's daughter spoke to the lawyers and the judges about the situation with her parents, when she spoke about being scared, she seemed prepared. If she seemed prepared, there would be allegations that Lisa was coaching her and that she was manipulated. But then if the child's recounting of events were missing details, then there were doubts about the validity of the story. At the end of the day, both parents now have equal access to the children, despite the abuse, despite the coercive control, and despite the harm that continues to be done to these children. The reality is that currently there's no law that protects people from situations like this, and from situations like the one that Lisa went through. And Lisa told me that she's extremely grateful that this legislation is moving forward, but she spoke about how much more work needs to be done. And she worries about the systemic issues that will still exist, even if, and hopefully when this bill is passed and implemented. A key part in Lisa's story is the fact that in every step of the judicial process, the system does not favor people who come forward and share about the abuse they're experiencing. When people report abuse to police, they are often turned away due to lack of evidence. If their case is accepted by the officer and brought forward to a judge, they risk the case being thrown out again. But if they are one of the few who get to have their case held in court, judges and lawyers have no requirement to be trauma-informed. And many judges, prosecutors, and other individuals in the criminal justice system don't have the training needed to understand the dynamics of intimate partner violence. There are also judges who have made sexist and misogynist comments during trials, judges who have ill-informed preconceptions about victims of gender-based violence. And so the enforcement of this legislation will be incredibly important. While many judges that would oversee cases of coercive control would be provincial, the federal government has a responsibility to lead by example and ensure that judges and lawyers that would work on cases of intimate partner violence, including coercive control, that they receive adequate training, that they be trauma-informed. Survivors of coercive control are not only abused by their partners, they face re-traumatization by the legal system itself. This needs to end. But that will only be accomplished if the government stops delaying, stops dragging their feet, and makes the reforms needed to support survivors of intimate partner violence. Survivors need a criminal justice system that supports them instead of re-victimizing them. And today, while Lisa is out of the relationship with her abuser, he is still able to control her through her children. While there are pieces of this legislation that touch on the fact that coercive control can include having children withheld from you or having threats of violence against children to control you, the topic of parental alienation isn't considered in this legislation. And we've heard from stakeholders like the National Association of Women in the Law that parental alienation is a controversial concept not founded in scientific evidence. It's used in clinical and legal settings to describe when children are refusing or resisting contact with a parent. And abusers use accusations of parental alienation as a form of coercive control. Unfortunately, this concept continues to be weaponized against women in abusive situations. It's weaponized to silence them, to remove the children from their care. You remove them from the care of the victim of abuse simply because the children do not want to spend time with the abusive parent. Organizations and frontline workers have been ringing the alarm bell on this. More than half of workers in women's shelters in Quebec describe the accusations of parental alienation, that this is a core priority for their shelter or their organization. It is one of their primary concerns. It is a real issue that not only has impacts on mothers, but also on children who may be facing situations of abuse or witnessing that abuse. And the impact of that abuse is so widespread, affecting women who are in women's shelters, in the healthcare system, as they access our judicial system. It has impacts on how they participate in our economy. And so, while I hope that this bill can be voted on and passed, I urge parliamentarians to consider the very urgent need to train judges, to train everyone in our criminal justice system, to change the legislation to better support victims of intimate partner violence, better support parents who are facing discrimination in our criminal justice system. And I want to take a moment to thank the many organizations that have come together to support this bill, who have had a hand in crafting this bill. I'm thinking of SAGES. I'm thinking of many of the organizations in my home community of Victoria. And this includes the Victoria Women's Transition House, the Cridge Transition House. I also want to take a moment to thank my colleague, the member from Esquimalt Saanich-Sooke, for his continued efforts to ensure that we criminalize coercive control. He first tabled this bill in the previous parliament and has been an incredible ally, an ally to victims of abuse, but also an ally to me in this parliament and an ally to women who face gender-based violence on a daily basis. I also want to take a moment to thank the courageous people who have come forward to share their stories. And that includes many of the survivors of intimate partner violence. It includes the family members who have shared their stories of loss. It includes professionals who have been working on the front lines of the crisis of gender-based violence and the crisis of intimate partner violence, who continue to advocate every day. And I also want to extend a thank you to my sister, who shared her story and allowed me to share her story, and who has pushed and supported me throughout this process to make sure that we are better supporting survivors of intimate partner violence and gender-based violence. These issues are so deeply rooted in our society, and we must do more. You know, as we have seen a rise in intimate partner violence, and we know that the cost of living crisis, the pandemic, all of these stresses have a detrimental impact on intimate partner violence. We need to come together in this chamber to pass this bill, but also to commit to giving victims and survivors the tools that they need to not only leave abusive situations, but to find justice in our justice system. Thank you.